Welcome everyone to this week's Master Instructor Roundtable. I am Wendt Batts here with my my co-host, I guess. I was going to say fellow whatever, but you know what? You're a friend, you're a Master Regional Instructor. You've been working with me forever.
Whatever you call me, Wendy, I'll say yes, it works. Good for me.
Well, Marty, thanks for joining me today, and I'm really excited about our topic. We're going to be talking about hip internal rotation. And I know this is an area of the body that is often limited in range of motion. So we're going to talk about how we can tell if it is, number one. We're also going to go over ways of programming to help somebody if they are indeed lacking that range of motion.
Yeah, from a human performance standpoint, and that could be anything, whether it's an elite athlete or someone who just wants to prevent low back pain. Having adequate hip internal rotation is crucial, or at least working towards what we'll call adequate. And it's just key to understand, like you said, Wendy, the basics behind it, why it's important, and then we'll talk about some programming strategies.
Yeah. And, especially when we see the rising numbers of people with low back, quote, pain or discomfort. I mean, internal and external rotation of the hips, guys, plays a very, very key and crucial role into limiting and decreasing some of that. We're not really treating pain, but discomfort. So hopefully today you're going to, come away with really understanding why looking at hip internal rotation with your clients is important. And then again, like I said, ways to activate the muscles that are allowing or causing that restriction if you notice that it's there.
This is something I work on every day.
I know. Trust me, one side, I am so locked up. The other side, not so bad. So I'm that one with the asymmetrical shift for sure. But, today when we really look at what we're going to discuss, we're talking about why internal hip rotation is important. Discuss the corrective exercise process in order to improve hip internal rotation, and then of course the programming ideas.
I think right to the point. Hopefully everyone will have some key takeaways.
Yes.
So Wendy, I know you and I both understand why hip internal rotation is so important. It's crucial. We've both come from an athletic performance background, athletic trainer, and you working in the physical therapy space when you came right out of college. But everybody, we say as an athlete, everybody needs to at least pay attention to their hip internal rotation and see where it's at. So, a key point here is once you achieve roughly 90 degrees of hip flexion, as you'll see in the photo here, and that happens a lot. That's kind of like the ideal place to go into a squat, right? People would like to be able to squat to parallel. The hip begins to internally rotate. So you'll see here on the picture, it'll show exactly what hip internal rotation is. And the reason the hip goes into internal rotation is to maintain that hip joint, that ball and socket congruency. So this is kind of just ideal motion or arthrokinematics of a joint. So it's normal effects to keep that femur, which is the ball, in the socket properly.
Yes, and it is a very deep. I mean, especially when you think about the comparison of your shoulder in relationship to your hip. I mean, the ball and socket obviously is very shallow in the shoulder and it's very deep in the hip, which again, we need it to be. That's super important. But, when you're looking at these pictures and then when we go to the next slide and you think about assessing it, it's important to know where is somebody when you're looking at internal and external rotation. And, ideally, you want someone to have approximately 45 degrees of hip internal and external rotation to be as ideal as possible. Now, how do you measure that? Well, in the previous picture, you saw someone laying on their back. Their leg was at a 90 degree, and then somebody rotated their hip into internal rotation and then had one of these guys, the human protractor, also known as the goniometer. This is something I still use very, very often because I grew up with it. I like it, and it tells me what I need to know. However, when you're going through the new corrective exercise content and the latest edition that NASM has brought to all of us, it's so easy to do because you don't need to understand the goniometer. Because if you guys have never used one of these, there's numbers everywhere. There's red numbers, black numbers, big numbers, small numbers. And if you're not really sure how to use a goniometer, it gets kind of confusing. So with the new assessment process, you're going to see back on the slide, one of the easiest that you can do with a client is lay them on their stomach. So they're putting them in a prone position. They can be on the floor. It doesn't have to be a table. You have them put their knees and legs together at, they're at 90 degrees like you see in the above picture, and then just let their legs go out to the side. You want to keep that 90-degree angle, so you don't want them to go past 90, meaning that their legs start to fall down towards the floor. And then look at them from the head, like you're standing where their head is and looking. Is it about halfway from 90 to the floor or the table? And if they're pretty much even, then it's a quote pass, meaning, yep, they have it. And then that's one way of doing it. And so again, we're trying to look, if they don't have it, it would be what we'd call, as Marty and I always say,
Waiting.
Marty makes fun of me, a big fat fail, or yes, they pass. And it's not uncommon to notice one side might be good and the other side might be restricted. So if you don't see asymmetries, then you need to know if one of them is not going to that halfway point.
Yeah, and we took these instructions and description right out of the text. So you can find it right there in the corrective exercise content, if you want to dig in and read more about it. But Wendy, you made it so easy for people to understand what we're trying to accomplish here.
Mm-hmm. And then, there's other assessments too. If somebody doesn't like to lay on the ground, or, you have a table or a chair or something where their feet can be floating off the ground. If you're my height, that's not hard to do. Obviously, if you're working with, really tall individuals, you need to make sure that their feet do not come in contact with the ground, like meaning that they can clear the space easily and they're not having to sacrifice their form. So you're sitting someone in an upright position, really good form, so still maintaining the kinetic chain checkpoints, but in a seated position. And then at that point, all you're going to have them do is bring their feet out to the side. So again, instead of them being face down, they're in a seated position. And then you're just looking again from like the table and where they started, is there a halfway point? Because again, ideally 45 degrees is what we're looking for. So you're going to take the 90 and cut it in half, and you're going to see, is it a pass or a fail?
And, the difference here, if you either are reading the type of motion or just thinking about what's happening with gravity or, how they're positioned. One, you have a passive test in the first one where gravity is going to show you how much range of motion. So it could be a muscular restriction if they don't go where they need to be. Here, could be a muscular weakness because you're contracting the muscles to put you into hip internal rotation. So we're not going to dive too far deep into that today. That's what we dive deeper into in the corrective exercise content and workshops, is really understanding passive, active, weakness, tightness. So you can be very specific. But yes, there is a difference in these two tests, but now you have two different tests you can use.
Yes. And again, we always want to assess. If not, we're guessing. So these are just some ways of going about that. And this is just the follow-up. Again, this is just more information. So if you guys do not have the corrective exercise content and you're looking for a little bit more information about what muscles might be restricted, or what might be overactive, because remember, just as a quick review, if you haven't gone through the corrective exercise specialist content, we do these different types of assessments because if somebody, let's say, had their feet turned out or their knees caved in or they had an asymmetrical shift, and then we took them into these mobility assessments and they could do some of these movements and they can do it well, meaning they quote pass, then it lets us know, well, listen, when they were moving in space and they were doing the overhead squat, then when they didn't do it well and we marked it as a compensation, but yet they know they can do it here, then it's actually a weakness. If they are restricted and they also were restricted during the overhead squat, then we know we need to spend more time foam rolling, stretching, and doing those types of exercises. But then we can flip it and really work on the muscles too, to increase and hopefully restore that proper range of motion throughout the corrective exercise continuum.
Well said. So going back to what you just said is the corrective exercise continuum. Remember, this is an evidence-based approach. So you would inhibit the overactive tissue first. It could be foam rollers. It could be the massage guns that you see out there. There's different techniques. Then you would lengthen anything that's chronically shortened. Then you could look at activating anything that is weak. And then you would integrate, get it back to where the whole body starts to play nice with each other. So I purposely put up here Vernon Griffith. He's a friend of mine. He is kind of known now on Instagram as like one of the things he's talked about is the hip. He really has some great content on there. And it's not just content for the sake of content. Vernon truly understands a strategic approach to how to improve hip mobility. So there's one other area that you can, or one way you can find content. But when you see someone like Vernon doing hip mobility stuff, plug it backwards into one of these four continuums. Is it the inhibit? Is it the lengthen? Is it the activate? Is it the integrate? don't just do it for the sake of doing it. Even if they're putting little nuggets of information out there, try to take that bit of information and put it back into your corrective exercise continuum, so you know exactly where these type of exercises or drills could be used.
Yes. And, just because it's on Instagram doesn't mean that it's right,
Right.
just
Right. So, obviously we have to talk about why hip internal rotation is important. And Wendy, you and I were chatting this morning, so I'm going to steal another line from Vernon. He just put this out there not long ago, and I love it. It's just so clear. You've got to treat a hip like a hip, not like a knee. And a lot of people in their life, they sit in a chair, they go on into the gym and they do a leg press, a leg extension, lunges in the sagittal plane. You've got to understand the hip is a ball and socket joint. It's designed to add mobility in multiple planes. So you've got to address the frontal plane. You've got to address the transverse plane. And that to me is just a great way that, I'm going to steal what he said, is treat the hip like a hip. So when you look at these high level athletes, so we'll start with the tennis player on the left. So as she now will be going through her backhand, I'm assuming that as she goes through that to attack the ball, she's going into dynamic hip internal rotation. If we look at our golfer here, he has to go into hip internal rotation on the backswing and then aggressively and dynamically go into hip internal rotation for his follow through. And then, of course, I'm always going to put a baseball one in there. Think of that hip internal rotation in the position that athlete is in right now. So your body's going to find a way to get somewhere. So hopefully if you have good hip internal rotation, you can do these type of motions very, very well. But if you look at our everyday athlete, Wendy, I travel a ton and I watch people try to pick up suitcases and move. Even when they're doing things, they don't realize that they're loading hip internal rotation when they're reaching down to pick up their grandchild or their pet that they're bringing, or they're reaching up and over to put up a suitcase. So we are trying to go in and out of hip internal rotation much more than we think every day, but not everybody truly has a strategy to improve it after they've assessed it.
Yeah, and I think it's important too, obviously when we're assessing, we do look at the ankle, we look at the knee, and we look at the hip. Guys, remember the knee is kind of the joint that's stuck in the middle. So if someone's complaining about having, like you might see some swelling or knee discomfort or knee pain, as somebody may tell you that's what they're experiencing, if they have really good mobility, or even if it's somewhat okay, again, ideally 20 degrees of range of motion at the ankle, and we don't have 45 degrees at the hip can actually really put the knee in a compromised position, especially when you're doing some of these rotational movements. Plus, Marty and I, we've talked multiple times about, some of our clientele. Again, we both kind of started out more in baseball. So working with athletes, especially baseball pitchers, coming back from a Tommy John rehab or coming back from, a labrum tear or something, really focusing on movement. It is astonishing that when you really look at getting better range of motion and looking at that 45 degrees as a golfer, how their speed ahead increases because they have the right rotational power and better range of motion. Same thing with the pitcher, that, just a couple miles an hour makes a significant difference, especially to the batter, but also for contracts. And so, and longevity. I think that's one thing that I leave out very often. In order to stay healthy, you've got to be as ideal in these major joints as possible. And because I've seen this be limited in all of these sports, it's one of the easiest things that someone can do to correct themselves and really start to feel better.
Right, without a doubt. And for those of you just joining us today on the Master Instructor Roundtable, Marty Miller here with Wendt Batts. We're talking all things hip internal rotation. So we're going to have gone through the importance assessments, what it looks like through different movements, and now we're going to even talk about some programming ideas. So Wendy, I was hijacking some pictures. So again, you see Vernon there on the left, as well as what I thought was we try to find the best images we can on the internet that are, within the 5 kinetic chain checkpoint. So as a precursor right here, Wendy and I didn't take these pictures. We look for the ones we can. If the 5 kinetic chain checkpoints are out of order, yes, we agree. It's always about the 5 kinetic chain checkpoints. But what you're seeing now through social media, which I love, is I think the word has gotten out there. Wendy and I can go back to where 15, 18 years ago, people thought we were nuts for doing foam rolling. We had to bring our own foam rollers. So like things are finally catching up. So one of the things that Wendy and I've always done is work on hip internal rotation, but now I see more of what I call hip internal rotation biased exercises. You see people doing them in the gym. You see people doing on Instagram. Like I think, again, the fitness industry is catching up. So you see Vernon doing a different version of like a pigeon there. So you could do it statically. You can do it actively with a reach. There's a lot of things you can do. And this one on the right could just be a hip internal rotation bias reach or lunge, where you're rotating over that lead leg with your torso, which is starting to get that ball and socket joint to have to move in and out of internal rotation. So there's nothing wrong with doing a sagittal plane lunge, but when it's time, you can also have that hip internal rotation bias. Now, remember, the foot, ankle, and knee would still be going straight. It's that you're loading over the hip internal rotation, but the knee would still be straight ahead in the sagittal plane.
And one thing that I've done a lot with my clients, especially when you're looking at the image on the right-hand side, is if you notice someone goes into knee valgus and they're really struggling and you want to start to incorporate different movements to try to actually get that movement throughout the hip. If you get close to a wall and you take a foam roller and you place the foam roller against the wall and then also to the outside of that client's knee, and you have them press against it. And again, they're doing the single leg. So they're in the exact same position, but now the foam roller is against a wall. And now on the outside of the knee, they have to kind of push into that foam roller, which then means they're pushing into more of an abducted position. They cross their hands and then they're having to go through internal range of, or internal and external motion. So they're swinging their torso side to side to get more movement throughout that. You're working on a lot of things. You're working on balance. So you're really working on foot alignment. You're also making sure the knee doesn't cave in because they're using their outer hip to fire, but then you're working through range of motion throughout the joint. And so there's a bunch of different ways of looking at possibilities that can help enhance someone's ability to do this. That's one of my favorite things to do when I notice that somebody's really lacking that, because there's a lot of different feedback. They're having to do that. So the knee has to remain intact with the foam roller, because if not, the foam roller falls. If they fall over because their balance is there, they have the other foot to tap down. So, and then again, really trying to teach them how to single leg, especially if they're in rotational sports, they're planning and then hitting or doing something like that. They're having the ability to work on what they need for their special activity, as well as just walking in general.
Yeah, I love those as well. There's so many great ways to do that. To me, it's almost like a flossing type of motion. You're just, or lubricating the joint. You're just getting that motion through that joint. And it's so critical for hip internal rotation.
Yeah. But also making sure you don't hip hike. I think that's also a really big compensation. We see sometimes people hike it and then drop it. You want to maintain really good movement throughout with as neutral pelvic alignment as possible.
Right. And some of the exercises here, I wish we had videos, but if you look at the far left one, all you're doing is you can see his left leg is straight and he's just doing a rotational crossover with his right leg. Simple. You could do it with a touch, maybe he doesn't put the foot down. There's different ways to do it. But what he's doing is he's really creating internal rotation on the leg, as he steps over. So it's just a great way, again, to kind of get a little motion, a little bit of a warm up as you get going. You can have the arms crossed. You can keep the chest still. There's ways you can do that. But then the one in the middle, I like to do these. There's, a split stance. You can almost do it like a Romanian deadlift. And instead of just reaching straight down, you reach across the body. And now that way you're starting to get that hip internal rotation on that lead leg. And then also, Wendy, I couldn't find it, but something like here with the pail off press, I will purposely put myself in a position of internal rotation on one leg and then press across my body. So I don't have to just press straight out. I could, on this individual, I could turn that left leg into slight internal rotation and then press out across a little more diagonal. And now I could still do that pail off press, but have an internal rotation hip bias if I need it.
Yeah. And guys, these are just different exercises to think about, because you can do anything and have your own way of trying to help someone really get better rotation. I really like all of these because Marty and I both together were like, oh my gosh, I do this one, I do that one. I mean, so it's good because, we're like-minded professionals, which is kind of scary. I think I can finish your sentences these days, Marty, but these are all really good things that actually work.
I would never suggest something that didn't work, right?
I know, but
right. But they're simple, right? You could do these anytime. And then some other ones, whether the band is there or not, I couldn't find one without the band. You can see his foot's kind of, leading a little bit, trying to get some extra range of motion, but let's assume his foot was dorsiflexed at 90 degrees. You could do a resistance band, but I kind of call these windshield wipers. I'll do these I put my fists there to make, or you could do like a potential yoga block just to make sure that you're keeping your hips in the right position. And if the hips start to flare out, you would lose contact. So it's just going into that 90-degree hip internal rotation. And then you can do here, it's like a reverse clamshell, right? So you're just doing sideline hip internal rotation, just very easy. You can do it without any equipment. Great for part of that corrective exercise, strategic warm up in the activation portion before you get to integration.
Yeah. And guys, remember too, posture and the 5 kinetic chain checkpoints and everything, it's going to be really about the quality, because it's very easy for someone that's very weak to compensate. And it may be slight, but that's, slight compensation will make a huge impact on whether this is going to be successful or not. So really watching those motions, watching how someone does it, making sure the motion and tempo is slow and controlled. And as Marty said, it's more fluid in motion. You don't want it to be choppy. If you notice that someone's struggling and they can only go part way and then they have to kind of readjust, if they had a band, definitely remove the band. Doing this without the band and gravity itself is very challenging to start. But then if they do end up, wanting to make it more challenging, or you think that they're ready to progress, then adding the band for sure. But I noticed, especially the one on the right, clients will easily want to kind of roll their entire body towards the floor, trying to get their foot to rise, especially when they get, around 7 or 8 reps.
Right. You'd think these would be easy, but so I think, Wendy, as we do a recap here, I think some of the key things is, establishing that ideal hip internal rotation needs to be addressed. It needs to be looked at. It needs to be considered through an assessment process. We took right out of NASM's texts how you could evaluate that hip internal rotation and the why. And then we will always, there's no question, Wendy and I will always bring it back to the model, whether it's the corrective exercise model or the OPT model. We view them all as one long continuum, of course, but this is crucial within that corrective exercise, targeted warm up. Let's really address hip internal rotation to make sure that there's adequate motion there. And again, we're looking for around 45 degrees. If we can get 30 and above, I think you're doing pretty well for most people. We're always going to look for that 45, but Wendy, you and I have evaluated people that have 5 degrees of hip internal rotation, maybe 10 degrees. Not good. That's why those
Marty, I had a professional golfer come and see me at -3.
That's impressive.
I mean, I've never seen anything like that in my life. So guys, and again, I did this one. I was like, okay, maybe my numbers are wrong. I used the new assessments. I mean, it was actually something.
Like the joint had calcified or something.
Yeah, I mean, but you know what? In all reality, literally within 3 training sessions and giving him things to do, we got him back onto the golf course at 35 and higher. So It can be done. It's just waking up muscles and then getting some of those to relax to make sure that, everything was firing the way it was meant to fire. It's amazing how, when you take the time to address something, how quick it can turn, as long as it's not something that, medically we can't do ourselves.
So you're saying the model works.
You know what? The model works.
What do you know? Well, with that being said, Wendy, I think that hopefully this was an interesting topic to our audience. I know that it's one of those things that kind of goes under the radar sometimes. So I'm hoping everyone got value. But if anyone wants to follow up with you, can you please provide them your contact information?
Yes, you guys can always email me at wendy.batts@nasm.org, or you can find me on Instagram at wendy.batts13.
And mine's coming up immediately right here, dr.martymiller72. And then email is marty.miller@nasm.org. So Wendy, great stuff as always. And to our NASM audience, thank you so much for joining us today on the Master Instructor Roundtable.